let's take a look at Genesis chapter 25. Here it says, Avraham took another wife, whose name was Ketura. She bore him Zimran and Yokshan, Medan and Midian, Yishbak and Shuach. Yokshan fathered Shiva and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Asherim and Letushim and Lumim. The sons of Midian were Ipha, Epher, Hanoch, Avida, and Elda'ah. All these were the descendants of Ketura. Abraham gave everything he owned to Yitzhak, but to the sons of the concubines he made grants while he was still living and sent them off to the east. I just noticed something that I'm going to have to look up. Somebody make a note of concubines, plural. Did you note that? I'll come back to you. So he sent them off to the east, to the land of Kedem, away from Yitzhak, his son. This is how long Abraham lived, 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last, dying at a ripe old age, an old man full of years. He was gathered to his people. Yitzhak and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zochar, the Hittite, by Mamre, the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Het. Abraham was buried there with Sarah, his wife. After Abraham died, God blessed Yitzhak, his son, and Yitzhak lived near Be'er Lahai Roi. Here is the genealogy of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar, the Egyptian woman, bore to Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael listed in the order of their birth. The firstborn of Ishmael was Nevayot, followed by Kedar, Adbeel, Mivsam, Mishma, Duma, Masa, Hadad, Tema, Yetur, Naphish, and Kedma. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names according to their settlements and camps, 12 tribal rulers. This is how long Ishmael lived, 137 years. Then he breathed his last, died, and was gathered to his people. Ishmael's sons lived between Havilah and Shur, near Egypt as you go toward Ashur. He settled near all his kinsmen. Here is the history of Yitzhak, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Yitzhak. Yitzhak was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean, from Padan Aram, and the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. Yitzhak prayed to Adonai on behalf of his wife because she was childless. Adonai heeded his prayer, and Rivkah became pregnant. The children fought with each other inside of her so much that she said, "If it's going to be like this, why am I alive?" Your translation may say something slightly different there. That's a very unusual translation passage. So she went to inquire of Adonai, who answered her, "There are two nations in your womb. From birth they will be two rival peoples. One of these peoples will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." When the time for her delivery came, there were twins in her womb. The first to come out was reddish and covered all over with hair like a coat, so they named him Hairy, which is what Esav means, hairy. Then his brother emerged with his hand holding Esav's heel. So he was called Yitzhak, Yaakov, which means heel grabber or grabbing onto the heel. Ekev is heel. Yitzhak was 60 years old when she bore them. The boys grew, and Esav became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Yaakov was a quiet man who stayed in the tents. Yitzhak favored Esav because he had a taste for game. Rivkah favored Yaakov. One day when Yaakov had cooked some stew, Esav came in from the open country, exhausted, and said to Yaakov, "Please, let me gulp down some of that red stuff. I'm exhausted." This is why he was called Edom, which means red. Yaakov answered, First sell me your rights as the firstborn. Look, I'm about to die, said Esau. What use to me are my rights as the firstborn? Yaakov said, first swear to me. So he swore to him, thus selling his birthright to Yaakov. Then Yaakov gave him bread and lentil stew. He ate and drank, got up, and went on his way. Thus, Esau showed how little he valued his birthright. Isn't that fascinating? We've got some interesting stuff going on here. So, let's take a look at a couple of foundational issues here. Number one, who is this Ketura woman? Have you heard anything about her?
Chronicle says that she was his concubine.
Yes. Now, what is the difference between a concubine and a wife?
Well, they'd be like a mistress and a wife.
Don't all talk at once.
It's like present day wife and mistress.
Well,
Those days maybe wife.
a mistress in today's vernacular seems to indicate that you're cheating on your wife.
Yeah.
Which I don't.
Yeah, and this was not done secretly back then,
Oh, yeah.
so it wouldn't be the same.
Right, right. Other ideas?
It's only legal status, I think.
I think that. What did you say?
Legal status.
What about legal status?
Well, wife, there's a ceremony.
Yes.
So
That is one thing that I have understood is that a concubine does not have a marriage contract. There's no ketubah.
Right.
Okay, but that says another wife.
It does. It does. So and that may be a translation from the Hebrew Jewish Bible. And I don't know if you look in your text. I would like to be interested to note whether you see the word wife in there. Angela?
For Isha, it means woman or wife.
Okay, so that.
Loyalty, it says addeth and taketh a wife. Does it say another? This does say add.
Okay.
Could be that he took a woman.
He took a woman. Yeah, okay, so the literal translation could be he took a woman. It doesn't necessarily have to be wife, although it could be. But in the traditional sense of you've got a marriage contract, she has certain legal rights and such like that. A concubine does not have that. Now, she does have some rights. You know, he has to provide for her and her children, but not to the extent of a woman who is the woman who's married and under the ketubah and having a legal contract, which these women, both Hagar and Ketura, did not have. Now, noted that he said concubines. Is that actually plural in the text in verse 6? It is. Okay, so there was.
The two of them, most likely.
Yeah,
It kind of lines up because it says he sent them to the east and
Right.
he only gave an inheritance to Isaac. And so that
Right.
must mean that the wife translation is.
Yeah. Well, the reason I asked that and the reason that caught my attention, and I think there are other pieces of evidence in this text that put perhaps this idea that a lot of people have mentioned is that Ketura and Hagar were the same person. That's a common idea. It's a very common idea in Judaism, and it's even mentioned in several of the regular Christian commentaries that I noted, that Hagar and Ketura are the same person, that Abraham simply brought her back in order to have more children with her once Sarah had died. But there are some problems with that. That the text seems to say concubines, plural. Sarah was certainly not a concubine. So unless there was some other woman that the Bible is just not telling us about that he took and had baby children with her, or maybe, gratification of the flesh, I don't have any idea, but it would seem odd. It's also kind of put to the test because you see here that the genealogy of the children born from these concubines are treated separately. I mean, you could perhaps say if somebody has said, well, Ketura and Hagar are the same person, well, why would they list the genealogies of their children separately? Why wouldn't it say, oh, Hagar also bore, these additional children? So I see some problems with that.
Yeah.
Well, you can't see any reason why they would even think that was also Hagar. So.
I don't know what they saw, but it's an very, very common commentators to say that there is a suggestion that this may have been Hagar. I don't know.
Is Ishmael's descendants are listed in the middle of this chapter?
It's possible. It's also possible that there were, I think I remember seeing something about, all of these people went and settled in the same place. I mean, if you see the lands that were inherited by Ishmael and his 12 princes, his sons, it's really the same place that all of these additional people went, the children of Ketura, that they all are dwelling in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, some of these tribes, these people in Ketura's children are notoriously difficult to track. There are some that, did you recognize any of the children of Ketura? Midian. Yeah, the Midianites play a pretty prominent role, and we have a good idea where they were, right?
Yeah.
Where were they at?
Saudi Arabia.
Near Egypt.
Saudi Arabia.
They were in Saudi Arabia on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba, and so we know where they were. Any other names that you recognize in here as coming from those children? Sheba and Dedan. Those are mentioned in the book of Isaiah, which is an interesting passage that we'll take a look at here in a minute. But a lot of the other ones they don't really know. But they do know that they settled somewhere between Egypt and Mesopotamia. That's a big spread. Some have suggested, there's a lot of speculation. Could be Oman, the United Arab Emirates, Yemen, the Yemenites. There's a whole bunch of wandering. There's a bunch of, that's definitely the strongest indication is these are the Bedouin tribes who wander those deserts, which it seems to certainly be suggested. But Abraham did indeed have many sons.
Why do you think he sent them in different ways? Like, okay, you guys, from the concubines, I'm sending you to the east, away from my son Isaac.
That's a great question. Why do you think that is?
I don't know, maybe for either fulfilling the promise to spread, or to forecome any future fights.
How does that seem to have worked out?
It never does.
What, it didn't seem to work.
No.
I agree. I mean, I think that he was doing the best he could to, I think, forestall eruptions that would happen within the family. I mean, clearly it tells us that he gave all of his goods, everything that he owned went to Yitzhak. He clearly recognized that Yitzhak was special and was the inherited promised seed.
And there's still a generation out before the 12 tribes.
Right.
Whereas Ishmael's already having his sons.
Yeah.
And there seems to be quite a bit of people that are spreading out of Ketura's bloodline.
Yeah.
Maybe he's taking the lead from him a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's some indication that he's trying to forestall fighting amongst his children. And it seemed, I mean, that Abraham was incredibly wealthy. And it's by all accounts the gifts that he gave, or the grants that he gave to these children and sent them off. He probably set them up pretty well, gave them a sizable chunk of cash and said, go off and live, Ketura, interesting thing about Ketura, you know what her name means? Huh?
Perfume or incense.
Perfumed or incense. And there is some speculation among scholars that she came from a people who lived in the Arabian Peninsula and were spice traders of like frankincense and myrrh, which is where those spices come from. And so that's kind of interesting. But yeah, she's likely going back to her homeland with her children. And so he gives each of her children, precious gifts in order to sustain themselves and establish a life back where their mother came from. So it's not, he doesn't send them off into the wilderness with a bag of water and a loaf of bread like he did Hagar and Ishmael, which is certainly interesting. That was a very puzzling thing.
So far as the timeline is concerned, I thought that Abraham was on his deathbed of sorts when he was talking to Eliezer. He was basically saying,
I don't know the day of my death.
I feel like I'm about to go. Why don't you go get my son a wife?
Well, and here's another thing that is kind of brought out in some of the commentary is that this does not say that Abraham took another wife after Sarah died. there is some speculation, and there's even some evidence here based upon the ages of these potential children and the age of Isaac, that he would have married Keturah either A, before Sarah died, or even before Isaac was born, that these children were older than Isaac, and that this is not a sequential telling of events.
Yeah,
This
that's
is
the thing. The timeline's
Abraham.
a little hazy here.
Yeah, Abraham is about to die. It tells us that he died in this section, and then it begins to we've already had a list of the sons of Ishmael, right? That came in, I think, Genesis chapter 17, where there was a brief section in there about the children. So this is kind of summarizing Abraham's life at the end of his life here. But it's not necessarily chronological. It is entirely possible that he married Keturah while Sarah was still alive, possibly quite a while ago. Maybe, and I wondered why that might be. Go ahead.
It would be, if that's the case, it would be probably up through verse 18, because it shifts then, because then the narrative is what happened after Sarah
Right.
had passed away.
Right. Yeah, that is, absolutely noted. But as far as when Abraham took this other wife, it doesn't tell us exactly. And people have speculated. Due to the ages of the children and the chronology, it's certainly likely that he took this concubine while Sarah was still alive. I guess we shouldn't find that terribly unusual. I mean, he had done that once before. I don't think that he intended to do it. It was at the suggestion of Sarah, if you remember. But I wondered, could it have been after God had spoken to him and said, "You will have a son by your wife Sarah," which we saw after Ishmael had been born and was like 13 years old? And then it's like within the next year or so, he gives the mother Sarah gives birth to Isaac. It's kind of questionable about when this happened, but it could be that he just thought, you know what, God told me I'm going to have children like the stars of heaven, and he told me that I'm going to have a child by this woman. Maybe it could be that Sarah had the child and then nothing. For another 5, 10, 15 years, Isaac is growing up to be 15, 20 years old. Remember that he was almost 37 years old when the Ketura, the binding on the mountain, happened. And so it's possible that he decided, okay, I've got the promised seed from Sarah. That's the golden child. But God said, I'm going to be the father of many nations. And I'm going to go ahead and fulfill that promise. I'm going to go ahead and take another wife and have some more children.
In you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Well,
this is true.
Come back here.
This is true. And you know what? That's a good point and a good opportunity, perhaps, for us to look at this other chapter, this other passage that we'll take a look at in a second. So it is possible that he took Keturah sometime while Sarah was still alive. Larry?
Well, this is on the topic in a way and off the topic in a way.
Okay.
And it's coming from a math teacher. Men had several wives.
Mm-hmm.
In those days, in ancient times. Men could have many wives.
Not uncommon, yeah.
It was not uncommon. And concubines.
Sure.
Okay? So, I wonder what the hierarchy was between why would he marry one and have a concubine as another? Solomon, how many wives? 800?
A lot.
400?
Yeah.
400 wives and concubines. Okay?
Right.
And all his peer groups, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
There must have been a lot more women than men.
Well,
if you have one man has 10 for his own,
mm-hmm.
if there's an even number of men and women roaming the planet, that means there's 9 men without partners.
Sure. Well, I think that the sociological demographics even today suggest that there are considerably more women than there are men on the planet. I think that's a common...
Not as many as this pans out for. So that's
Well,
why it's strange to me.
And I understand what you're saying, but consider also that the men that we know about who have multiple wives are incredibly wealthy. And frankly, you'd have to have quite a bit of money to support a whole bunch of wives and their children. The ones that we know about are kings and princes and people like Abraham who are incredibly wealthy. It is my assumption that a person like myself, perhaps, or Daryl, could not afford to have multiple wives.
So
Carla's enough,
It's less common than.
She's expensive.
It's less common than.
It might be less common
know.
just because it's not economically practical and feasible. Although,
Well, I know, and what ties in with the LDS, with the specials they were doing with the polygamy,
oh yeah,
what they would do is send all these boys and make them leave the village because
To
they
not
didn't want
compete.
the competition, because every man would
Sure.
have 30 wives.
Yeah.
This is present day.
yeah, I see
That's
what
how
you're
that was
saying.
accomplished.
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
The boys
Interesting.
could not be allowed to stay in the town.
Yeah, competition. Sure, I
I'm just
understand.
thinking of that era, if it's anything like, you think about in older days, a lot of women died in childbirth.
Yeah,
And we even
Sure.
read about Rachel
mm-hmm.
doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So it might mean that to continue on, you do need a lot of them and a lot to
Yeah.
watch over all of
Yeah.
this.
Well, I think, and that's a really key consideration, and that will be part of our discussion regarding the birthright, is that there's special responsibilities and rights that come with that. And there is no Social Security, so your children are your Social Security. And if you've got a number of sons who can contribute to the upkeep in mom and dad, I mean, that's my Social Security plan. I took care of my kids for 18 years. They can take care of me for the last 18 years. They're already being trained.
Also for
Hold on, Nathan. Hold on. Go ahead, Keith.
Yeah, but they were the employees that had your household prosper, so you wanted as many of them as you could too.
Absolutely. We need them to manage the household as it grows and sheep and making them additional income, being able to take care of me when I get old, my wife in case I die before she does, which is common. Not common in Bible times apparently, but it is nowadays. So yeah, that's a good point. Nathan?
Even today, men tend to die before
Yes.
men die younger, but way more so in ancient times. Men would die a lot younger
I would imagine.
because of the hard lives and
Sure.
they would die in war. Whenever you go to war, how many of your men do you lose at war?
Yeah.
And then you go back and you got way more women than you have men because
Sure,
men
sure.
die in war.
Well, and it might be another reason to have many sons, is that some are old enough to go to war and some are not. You're going to lose some sons through attrition, as it were, and you need more children to, replenish the fold, so to speak. So it
52
is,
million died in World War II.
yeah, absolutely. So it is certainly possible that that might have been a consideration for Abraham. Now he's got a tremendous amount of wealth, but you can see that he was already concerned about leaving all of this wealth to Eliezer of Damascus, who's going to inherit all my stuff. He's like, no, you get your seed. But then one child in those days, I mean, it was shameful enough that he didn't have any children for a long time. But then to have one child that's designated, that had to sting. So it's certainly possible that he went and thought, I need more than one child. God will protect this child and I'll give him everything and I'm going to confer the spiritual blessings on him, but I need more posterity. I need more for my tribe. Now, did the nations of Abraham become great? Yes, they did. I mean, those are some of the wealthiest people on the planet nowadays. I mean, these are very wealthy people. They don't have anything except oil coming out of the ground, but that's an expensive product. And they're making a killing off of it. So, and they're still living in that ancestral land of theirs forever. From these days, they're still there. So that's certainly one consideration. Now, I want to take a look really quickly at the prophetic picture of these peoples and how they interact with the children of Israel. The generations of the chosen coming down the pipe here. If you want to take a look at Isaiah chapter 60 with me, this has got some interesting stuff in it. Isaiah chapter 60, just read a little section of this to you, starting right from the beginning, just because I love this section. Note some of these words and people groups that are identified in this section. It says, arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of Yahweh has risen upon you. For look, darkness covers the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But Yahweh arises over you, and his glory is seen upon you. And the nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. Lift up your eyes all around and see. all of them have gathered. They have come to you. Your sons come from afar, and your daughters are supported on the side. Then you shall see and be bright, and your heart shall throb and swell, for the wealth of the sea is turned to you. The riches of the nations come to you. A stream of camels cover your land, the dromedaries of Midian and Ephah. All those from Sheba come, bearing gold and incense and proclaiming the praises of Yahweh. All the flocks of Kedar are gathered to you. The rams of Nebaioth serve you. They come up for acceptance on my slaughter place, and I embellish my glorified house. There is a fascinating and powerful passage of end times that features many of the, not many, but a handful of these children of Ketura. Midian, Sheba, and Dedan. It's just fascinating. Now, what is this a picture of? What is this prophetic picture that we're seeing here in Isaiah chapter 60? Has this happened?
No, it's going to happen.
It has not happened yet. It is prophetically telling us that the children of these people are going to worship God.
Amen.
And basically give great honor and prestige to Abraham's chosen descendants through Isaac and Jacob and the 12 tribes. That has not happened yet, but it's coming.
At the end of that chapter, I think, is like the New Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Totally yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like
18 or
19.
It's a fascinating section which really tells us about these descendants of Ketura, that they will come and bow down to Yahweh. They will worship God. They will correct their having gone wayward and begun to, worship the moon god Allah and such. They will actually come around at some point, just like everyone will. All knees will bow.
Yeah.
It's going to be fascinating, isn't it? And I can't wait for that day when the people of God are not, oppressed and hated. But this is what it is. So that's some interesting stuff about these descendants of Abraham from the other women. But now let's get to this curious thing here that you note in verse 8. That it says that Abraham breathed his last and died at a ripe old age, an old man, full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Did you note that this is the first time that this happens in the historical record? It is not the first time that this phrase comes up. This was prophesied by God in Genesis chapter 15, verse 15. But this is when it actually happens. That was kind of presaged from Genesis chapter 15. So he said in Genesis chapter 15, you're going to die a ripe old man and you'll be gathered to your people, and here it actually happens. So notice that whenever someone would die in the Torah prior to this, it just says they lived to this age and they died. They lived to this age and they died. They lived to this age and they died. And then all of a sudden here we get introduced to he was gathered to his people. Notice who else was gathered to his people. Ishmael.
Yeah.
It says that Ishmael was gathered to his people. What does that mean? What is your impression of that?
From what I've understood, it's the burial process that when they died, they would put them in a place till the flesh was gone and the bones were left.
Mm-hmm.
And then they put all the bones of the family members in the same place.
I assumed that same thing.
Okay.
But when I did more research, I discovered that this particular phrasing of gathered to his people in most cases does not happen where they are actually buried with their ancestors. It's a peculiar thing. And that's exactly what I assumed, is that this is talking about just being buried where your ancestors are buried, in the family tomb or the family crypt. Now, Abraham absolutely was buried with Sarah, and his wife, his son, and his wife would also be buried in the same place, as well as Jacob and Leah. Rachel died on the road, on the way to Bethlehem. But a lot of times when this says they are gathered to their people, they are not buried in the same area as their ancestors. And many have suggested, and I think I tend to agree, and you can let me know what you think, that this is essentially the first instance we have of something indicating that there is life after death.
I wonder if there's any connection to the parable of Lazarus and the rich man.
It's certainly possible. What did you say?
I made a joke.
I knew you did. Well, this is certainly, what's very curious to me? You know that in the time of Yeshua, the Sadducees got into a bit of a discussion with Jesus about the woman who had married the 7 brothers, and in the resurrection, whose wife is she's going to be. And they're kind of teasing him, making a joke. And he's like, you don't understand anything, nor do you understand the power of God.
Well, they didn't believe in resurrection, right?
They did not believe in resurrection. They did not believe in life after death.
A big argument for why there is no resurrection.
Right. Yeah.
Married to?
Right. So they didn't believe in the resurrection at all. Keith?
Now, I'm going to put this out there. And I don't
You
know
go ahead and drop it, buddy.
how many of you have read the book of Yasher, but Abraham and Ishmael had a good relationship in that book.
Seems to be.
He visited his son.
Yeah.
He gave him marriage counseling, told him to get rid of one of his wives, which he did.
Yeah.
Okay, there's some very interesting stuff in there.
Yeah.
So this thing about Ishmael, which we always think is the dark sheep of the family, and then you read and they name the 12 sons for those 12 tribes. There's something special here going on that he was seen in Abraham's eyes as being righteous. He knew the way of God.
Mm-hmm.
So this thing about, we always think that, that's the start of the Muslims right there. No, that happened much later. These were all
That's
God-fearing
2,000,
people. Exactly.
1,000 years later,
Exactly.
sure.
But people say, Ishmael, that was the start of the end for them. No, he was still very God-fearing, knew Yahovah, and
Sure.
his father taught him everything.
I've had to disabuse myself of some of those notions. I mean, the only thing that is ever said in a negative sense about Ishmael is that he mocked the baby Isaac when he was born. We don't know exactly what that means. He was 13 years old when it happened, but Sarah said, get rid of this kid. But he did come back here in the Torah to help bury his father. And yes, in the book of some of the extra biblical stuff, like the book of Jasher, it does describe a good, loving, thriving relationship with his father. So that's certainly possible. And I think you make a good point that we don't want to ascribe, the modern Arab sympathies to Ishmael, which I think is a good insight. Tracy?
I was just doing a word search on that gathered to as people in the Hebrew,
Mm-hmm.
and it showed up a handful of times. And it says it about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
Ishmael.
Right. What do you make of that?
I don't know. It's just interesting. I never noticed. It may be used other times, but that exact spelling
Mm-hmm.
is in regards to those people. I always hear about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
But Ishmael?
But Ishmael's in there.
Yeah.
Gathered to his people.
That is curious, yeah. Mike?
I think because the way it's used with Jacob, it's clearly talking about not just being buried.
Yeah.
Because it says, I'm about to be gathered to my people,
Mm-hmm.
bury me beside my fathers in the
Right.
cave.
Right.
So, if he's about to do that, why does he, you know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah.
It's two
What
separate
verse is
things.
that?
It's Genesis 49, 29
Thank you.
through
Who was asking to be buried in the cave?
Joseph.
Jacob.
Oh, Jacob, when he was dying, had pulled his legs up into the bed. Yeah, that's right.
Buried by who in the cave? Who does he want to be buried by in the cave?
Joseph.
He wants to be buried by all of his relatives, right? It says,
Abraham and Sarah.
On the Hittite,
See,
in
that's-
the cave in which who
Remember-
sold it to him? Machpelah,
Ephron?
which is before Mamre in the land of Canaan in the field of Abraham.
Oh,
Yeah,
so the
rem-
cave in the field?
Yeah.
The cave in the field. Okay.
Oh, I lied. Moses. I was covering up the last one.
Moses was gathered to his people. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it's interesting. I read some extra biblical texts, and in the books of Adam and Eve, they talk about a cave where they were all buried, like the cave where Adam was buried, and then Seth was buried there, and then Enoch was I don't know if Enoch was buried there, and there's something special about it, and they like I don't know, there's some like magical stuff going on. There's always
three seeds in his mouth and then becoming a tree. Or was that something else?
I'm not sure if that's part of it,
Okay.
but
That's a weird one.
there was just something special about like them all being buried in the same place. So that's interesting. That Jacob won't be buried in the same
Yeah,
place.
we talked about that a week or so ago regarding the mausoleum that was built over the cave of Machpelah in the field in Hebron. But it is curious to me the way that this is spoken of here. And as I was saying, the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. And Yeshua was curious to me that Yeshua said in relation to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he's the God of the living, not the dead, which I found fascinating. It's like, okay, so he's saying that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are alive somewhere. He's not the God of the dead, he's the God of the living. What is also curious to me is that the Pharisees did believe in the resurrection. But what's fascinating is, that I like to listen to rabbinic commentaries and sermons every once in a while just to gain some additional insights into these sections. And, there was a talk that was given at Sinai and Daba this last year by this rabbi, and he was describing a scene in which a Jewish woman's husband had died. And she went to the local rabbi to find out what happens when you die. And the rabbi told her, we really don't have any idea. Your soul is snuffed out. Maybe it'll be resurrected later. Maybe it'll be reincarnated. She was horrified by this answer and looked out and searched out another rabbi. And he basically said the same thing. We don't really know. It was kind of weird and disheartening. They don't have this perception that when you die, your soul is going to heaven. That is not something that they considered at all. What's that?
That's terrible.
What is?
Well,
I was, yes, I was totally surprised. There was no comfort. There was no comfort. But then she went to a third rabbi who was the guy giving the talk, and he says, I was stunned that these rabbis had told her this. And he comforted her and, told her, that he believes and had some scriptures to back it up, that the soul does return to God from whom it came, in whatever sense you believe. But I was really surprised and began to look it up and look around a little bit. And frankly, that's one of the areas of Judaism where it's just not a big emphasis placed on that. It's just not. Now the Pharisees in the time of Yeshua did talk about a resurrection. Paul appealed to, when he was, being persecuted by all of the leaders of the congregation in the ends of the book of Acts. And he realized, okay, wait, we got some Pharisees over here and some Sadducees over here. If I ally myself with the Pharisees, they'll fight with me against the Sadducees, and maybe I'll get to live or something. So he's, I believe in the resurrection. And the Pharisees and Sadducees began to fight, and it turned into a little bit of salvation for him. But these days, it really seems like in Judaism, there's a kind of a vacuum and this gaping hole of not being able to share with the people that the soul returns to God. And there's not a bit of comfort there. And I just see here some of the beginnings of that. And what's interesting to me is, and this is a fascinating idea that you guys might think about and kick around in your mind, and that is that for the ancients that received the Torah, there were great mysteries here. And it was not fully elucidated. There was a lot of mysterious things that were not understood, and that it was only with the advent of King David that the mysteries and the deep riches, and such as the idea of eternal life, were really brought forward under King David, which I find fascinating. And you can see when you read the Psalms that a lot of things are brought out in the Torah. They say in the rabbinic circles that David was filled with the Spirit of God and had tremendous wisdom and power in interpreting the Torah, and he brought that Torah to life like it never had been before, which I find fascinating because that's the progenitor of the Messiah, and that the Messiah, the descendant of David, would fully elucidate the Torah to an extent that David could never even have dreamed of. Tracy?
I was just thinking about, just to throw it out there,
Mm-hmm.
what's up with that thing with Saul and Samuel when he calls him up out of the earth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Calls him up out of the earth, and then Samuel tells him, tomorrow you and your sons are going to be with me. So, what's that about?
That is definitely fascinating. In Sheol, yeah. I don't know. That has always tripped me out, frankly. I think it obviously tripped out the medium who called up his spirit, because I don't think that had ever happened before. She was a charlatan, but this happened for real this time. That was my interpretation.
I think just the doctrine of the resurrection is curious. It's not only lost on the Jews in Judaism, it's totally lost in Protestantism. I mean, this doctrine of the resurrection, which was understood in Jesus' day, I think even Jesus was talking about the resurrection, and his some of his companions said, "Oh yes, well we know about the resurrection. We know that the resurrection at the last day." I mean, there's a doctrine in the Scripture where I think it says all the earth will give up her dead, and all the sea will give up their dead.
That's in Ezekiel, isn't it? Yeah, and you know what's fascinating is you're right, in regards to the Christian church, there's a huge number of people, it seems like a predominant theory, that you die and you go to heaven, and that's where you stay.
Heaven is the only concept. There's no resurrection. They only have like there's a physical resurrection prophesied in the Old Testament, and Christians don't have that at all. I never learned about the physical resurrection.
You know, I got to tell you quite honestly that it has been in the last decade that I have really begun to have that sink in. It's like the Bible does not say that I am going to spend eternity in heaven. It never ever says that. That I actually am going to be resurrected in a physical body and live on this planet. And that is very clear in the text.
And then a new heaven and a new earth.
And a new heaven and a new earth.
Also not plucking a harp.
Right. Yeah, that's the whole thing, is that we had this idea of being in heaven and plucking a harp in the clouds and being engaged in some kind of, celestial worship that forever.
It is a unfulfilled prophecy of the Old Testament. I think Protestantism pretty much throws out the Old Testament, even if some of the prophecies are unfulfilled.
Yeah.
The resurrection is one of the most.
That's the most prominent.
Like how do we miss that? How do people miss?
It's amazing how much we miss when we really just kind of believe in our doctrines of the church and we kind of forget about our Bibles. It's very, very common, unfortunately.
It's interesting that the Jews would have lost it too.
There's a lot of lost truth, isn't there?
Resurrection.
It's amazing what happens when you actually read your Bible. It's really amazing what happens.
So where do the Christians get it then?
Get what?
That there is no such thing as a resurrection.
No, that it's not that they don't. It's not that they don't believe in a resurrection. It's just that they have maybe forgotten, or that they have a misconception which helps them to just overlook what the Bible actually says. It seems to me, because they know they're going to live forever, but the context and how it happens and where it happens is gone.
Is that also the same as the issue always with? And sometimes they exchange it, but like the kingdom and heaven.
Yes,
the
kingdom of heaven. See, I think that they kind of latched onto this is the kingdom of heaven, so we must be going to heaven. It's the kingdom that has its source from heaven. And also you got to remember that in Judaism, which is basically, I think that this is something that's really huge, is that you got to realize that we are now, and should have been all along, a branch of Judaism called, according to the New Testament, Ha-Derech, right? The way. This started off as a offshoot branch of Judaism. We chucked all that out the window and became our own little thing, and suddenly all of the context, all of the prophecies, all of the interpretations from a Hebrew perspective were just gone, and it lost so much of its meaning. Because remember that when the Jews don't use the name of God, right? They say Hashem or Adonai. You know what else term that they use to talk about God? Heaven. Heaven is the word that they use to refer to as God. That's what they do. Who's going first? Which of you two are knocking each other over the head trying to talk first?
But I think that following was the Nazarene. I think there was a name for them, they called them. But you guys didn't read that best-selling book that
Tim LaHaye?
Lazarus wrote about, it was one of the lost books, but you had to read that. He told everything that happened.
The lost books?
And you let him go first.
Who?
Yeah.
The book of Lazarus. You didn't read his book?
No, I
He
did not.
explained everything.
He's making jokes.
Oh, he's making jokes. Okay.
So, what
I
was
didn't
gonna
get that.
at is, I guess there's that time when your eyes close, and of course Yeshua said he sleeps. And
Yes.
The next conscious thought that you would have was being lifted up when Yeshua comes to get you.
You know, I have thought about that too, buddy, and that seems to make some sense in certain passages of the scripture where you just go to sleep and the next thing you know, you wake up and you're in the resurrection. However, there are certain other passages like Paul saying, it is much better for me to go to the Lord, to be with the Messiah than to continue to live. There are a couple of passages which leave you with the idea that you're going to Jesus when you die. You know, either way is fine. I mean, if you go lights out and then you wait, next thing you know, it's like getting up and going to bed in the morning. You know, you're going to bed at night and waking up. Hours have passed, but you're not aware of that. Could have been, you know, Abraham goes to sleep right here in this passage, and for all he knows, he went to bed last night and woke up, and bam, he's being resurrected by the Messiah. That doesn't bother me. But then you have this idea of, you know, Samuel comes back. Paul's saying it's better to be with the Lord than to be, you know, I don't know which to choose, be alive or be dead, because be dead is...
Does Samuel say who awakened me? Isn't there some language like that?
Yeah, that language is in there.
Kind of like,
You know, and then that's why you have books written about people saying, what happens after you die? Nobody knows. But something does.
I have just a little bit to say.
I'll bet you do.
I got a lot to say, but I won't go into a lot. But just a few things that come to my mind is, you know, we have the thief on the cross where he does say, today you'll be with me in paradise. So
Actually, that's not what he says.
Okay, well, that's the way,
That's what everybody
my
thinks it
Bible.
says,
So-
but that's not what it says.
Okay, so maybe then we'll look at that. But so how I interpret it is when you die, it says that our soul does return back to God.
That's my understanding.
It does say that.
Mhm.
And so I look at it like heaven really isn't, he's preparing a place for us, but
Yeah.
it's not really done yet, I don't think. I mean, I don't know that much about that.
Well, if the
but-
place is on this earth, then it's clearly not done.
Yeah. Well, the way I read it is, it's like a kingdom that will be placed on this earth. So it's
Sure.
not done yet. So
You need to read the study I just sent out on Saturday because that's what that's about.
yeah, that will be definitely interesting. But I do think that yes, our soul does return back to God. I think there is. It's not purgatory, but I think that there is a paradise that we do go to, and I think that also there's so many things in Scripture that kind of talk about heaven and what it is like. So whether it's not done yet, I don't know. Maybe our duty is also to help prepare the place that will be here on earth for
Sure.
others. I don't know.
Yeah.
But I find it very hard to believe that even when we sleep, we dream. Or we're just... I find it hard to believe that your soul just goes into a full sleep and then at the resurrection we're just... Yes,
Yeah.
I do believe we are resurrected, but we also, towards the end
Sure.
times in Revelations, also it does mention too that, you know, I believe that part of the church will come back with him as well, you know, with the army. So, you know, I think you can go both ways.
You can.
You know, you can go a lot
There's
of different
definitely
ways.
plenty of room for interpretation there, but I'm totally on board. Angela, I apologize.
We have to try and remember, and it's really hard for us in our physical bodies. We live in a world that has 4 dimensions: height, width, depth, and time. Our soul and our spirit, once it's disconnected from our physical body that's locked into those 4 dimensions, is not subject to time. So it's very difficult for us with this whole idea of what happens after you die to understand we are no longer subject to time. And what we are discussing here is, how does that time go by? There is no such thing. It's like a circle trying to understand what it is to be a sphere. We don't get it. We can't explain it.
Do you believe, however, that if you leave your body because it dies, that your consciousness is that what you actually are, right? Your consciousness, your soul, your spirit.
That's a complicated thing, but that is the nefesh, the breath of God, include the consciousness and the personality and such. Nobody really knows.
All I know
Yeah.
is that this
That's all we
world
are.
only has a few dimensions,
Yeah.
and there's others. quantum theory has established there are at least 10 dimensions.
Correct.
We are only subject to 4 right now because we are locked in these tabernacles. So us trying to understand things that are outside of that is
It's really kind of pointless. It's fascinating to conjecture, but it's really kind of pointless. Yeah.
But do you believe that between now and then, when a new kingdom comes, that the consciousness
Your question
is not
right
there?
there contained the element of time. You said when this and then this. And what I'm saying is
Cut out the element of time and try to make sense of that.
Makes sense.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating, but we're not going to solve it. Tracy,
No?
Transfiguration.
what'd you say?
I was just going to talk a couple things about what, as they say in the book of Acts about David. He's foretelling the Messiah's resurrection. He's saying that David is not ascended into heavens, but he said he saw the Lord sit at his right hand. So there's a clue there about David not being in heaven. However, when Messiah rose, he lifted some people up. There's something going on there. There were, the first fruits that went up with him of some sort.
Yeah.
So something might have changed after that point. But like Angie said, I think it's outside of time.
That's a curious thing. I mean, if those people were resurrected with him, what, did they just die again? That doesn't
make sense.
That doesn't make any sense.
But another thing that proof text for Christians, which I think is out of context, is absent from the body, present with the Lord. But Paul is talking all kinds of stuff about walking in the Spirit and not in the flesh, and I think that is what that is actually about. Is when you are not walking in the flesh, you are walking in the presence of God, and that is biblical.
Yeah.
And then I was going to say something else about
What Angie said.
what Angie said about
Dimensions or something?
outside of time, but I don't remember what it was now.
Okay.
I have a Hebrew grammar question real quick. So
Sure.
gathered, where it says Abraham was gathered, I mean, like in English, you don't gather one thing. You gather a group or a set of things. So
Right.
it doesn't really work grammatically in English.
Sure.
Abraham can't be gathered.
Right.
Unless
But
he's
you
in
have to remember, gather is an English word, and the Hebrew word probably doesn't just mean
Yeah, that is
English
Right.
gathering.
Yeah, I'm just curious about all the scholarship here.
I have no idea. Something else.
with the Hebrew, because the
Well, I
English
can
doesn't
tell you.
make sense.
I can tell you, and we can take a look at this. That is verse 8. Okay. So he was gathered.
And was gathered.
So the word for gathered is asaph, to gather, receive, remove, or gather in. He was gathered into. I assume that the grammatical structure is he was gathered into where his ancestors were. What does that mean? I don't
Still,
know.
one scatters, one gathers. It's gathering.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah, that's
group
an
of
interesting.
things. Maybe just the definition is iffy. What you said the other definitions were receive.
Mm-hmm.
You can receive just one thing, but
Sure,
you don't gather
sure.
just one thing.
That's true. That's true.
Oh, about the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, where
Yeah.
Abraham's in paradise. It is a parable. You have to keep that in mind, so it
Yeah.
cannot be literal.
Yeah.
However,
Thank you.
there is this word Messiah, or that Messiah says paradise when he says the man on the cross. But that is not, we like to put in our grammar, our punctuation and say, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise, rather than I tell you today, you will be with me in paradise.
Yes.
But it could be that there is some kind of place, like Abraham and Lazarus and the rich man were,
Yeah.
and that could be this holding place that he's referring to.
Well, the Catholics did not make up the idea of purgatory. I think I've mentioned that before, that Judaism holds to an idea of purgatory. So the Catholics and the Jews share that idea of purgatory in common.
Also, today you'll be with me in paradise rings back to the whole concept of time. If there is no time in paradise, when Jesus says today,
Right.
what does he mean? He
I
doesn't
think
mean
it's
today because we're dying
yeah.
today.
I
No,
think
the
it's
sun's
more
not gonna rise in
likely that
paradise.
when he said that, he was saying, "I am telling you the truth today.
Yeah.
You will be with me in paradise. Not today. You will be with me in paradise."
But even then, if it were saying today, what's the definition of day in paradise anyway?
Well, that's a good point.
For us, the day is sunrise, sunsets.
But that is the biggest challenge with most of our Bible texts that we're trying to struggle through, is that these are spiritual concepts, and you're trying to, like Paul complained about when he was writing his letters is like, I'm speaking in human terms because of the weakness of your flesh. You can't make sense of a lot of this stuff unless you anthropomorphize God and you try to take, that's how you master, mashal, rule over these truths, is by using parables. There's no other way to do it. Then, discussing spiritual matters is like dancing about architecture.
And I think, obviously it's for a reason. It's like you've got your eyes focused in the wrong place. And
Yeah.
I think it rings back
Yeah.
to, he who seeks to save his own life will lose it. It's like, what is your focus? Are you focused on preserving your life, what's going to happen to me? Or are you
Right.
focused on building my kingdom on earth?
Right.
Because that's what we're doing.
Right.
We're building the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. This is a parable.
Right.
And then when Elijah showed Elisha a different dimension, that's what I was going to say. He said, look, could you just open his eyes for a second and let him see something else? And then he saw something else.
Yeah.
So I think whatever that else is still there.
Yeah,
We
absolutely.
have to believe and have faith that this is not it.
That is a good point, absolutely. And I think that's a good place to end this discussion, is our eyes are blind, truly.
And it says we will be seen. Right now we see in part. And this
Right.
is not that paper I sent out. It's really interesting stuff. Right now we see in part. We see in a mirror dimly. As if looking into a big body of water. You can't see very clearly. But
Right.
it's there. But if you're
Right.
still, you can see more.
Yeah.
But in that day, we will be known just as we are known. We will know just as we are known. We will see it clearly
Yeah.
in that day.
The
Right
scales will fall off our eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a ton of fascinating stuff. And you know what? We didn't even get to Jacob and Esau. Isn't that fascinating? Well, that leaves some awesome material for next week.
Yeah.
Let us pray.